Welcome, my friends. Before we begin, I invite you to sit back, relax, maybe enjoy a cup of coffee, or simply lie down comfortably on your bed. Leave behind the noise of the day and let your mind settle into a calm space. In this moment, it's just you and me, sharing a story that I hope will touch your heart. So take a deep breath, make yourself at ease, and let's step together into today's video. The midwife's hands trembled, slick with blood, as she fought to save the life of the 13-year-old girl writhing in agony on the straw-strewn bed. The air in the chamber at Pembroke Castle was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the stifling heat of a fire that roared despite the bitter winter of 1457. For hours, the girl, barely more than a child, had been screaming, her voice hoarse, her small frame shuddering as her body attempted something it was never meant to endure at such a tender age. The baby was lodged, immovable, and the mother was fading. Death lingered in the shadows of the stone walls, its presence as palpable as the midwife's frantic whispers. Everyone in that room knew a truth that history would later try to erase. Margaret Beaufort should never have been pregnant. In this tale, spanning the next hour of your time, we unravel a story medieval chroniclers polished to a sheen, hiding its jagged edges. This is not merely a recounting of medieval marriage customs, but a harrowing account of how one man's greed shattered a child's body, how England's most powerful stood idly by, and how a traumatized girl grew into one of Tudor England's most formidable women. What you're about to hear draws from contemporary accounts, medical records, and the chilling confession of Margaret's own priest after her death. More disturbingly, Margaret's story was not an outlier. It was part of a pattern so grotesque that even in the 15th century, it was deemed wrong yet permitted. Picture this: May 31st, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. A baby girl is born, her cries echoing through the damp stone corridors of a fortress perched amid rolling fields. Her name is Margaret, and from her first breath, she is not a child, but a commodity. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, is among England's mightiest lords, his wealth and titles a beacon to allies and enemies alike. The castle buzzes with the clatter of servants, the scent of fresh rushes on the floor, and the distant clang of armor as knights patrol the grounds. Margaret's world should have been one of safety, wrapped in the warmth of her mother's arms, surrounded by the songs of minstrels and the laughter of her half-siblings. But within a year, fate deals a cruel blow. John Beaufort is found dead in 1444, his body cold in his chambers. The whispers of suicide rippling through the court like poison. In medieval England, suicide was more than a sin. It was a stain, a disgrace that marked an entire lineage. The chronicler John Harding later wrote of the scandal, noting how the Duke's death left his family tainted by shame, their honor undone. Suddenly, baby Margaret, not yet old enough to toddle, becomes vulnerable prey. Her inheritance, vast lands, titles, and wealth, makes her a prize in a world where power is measured in acres and allegiance. The halls of Bletsoe, once filled with her father's booming voice, now hum with the hushed tones of ambition. Margaret's mother, Margaret Beauchamp, fights to shield her daughter. A widow of fierce resolve, she keeps little Margaret close, raising her alongside her half-siblings from earlier marriages in what should have been a haven. The scent of lavender from the herb garden wafts through open windows, and Margaret, barely able to hold a quill, is taught to read French. Her quick mind absorbing lessons in Latin prayers and courtly manners. Her mother's efforts paint a fleeting picture of hope, a girl with a sharp intellect, destined perhaps for a life of learning or influence. Chronicles from the time, like those of the Paston family letters, describe noble mothers educating their daughters to navigate a treacherous world, and Margaret Beauchamp was no exception. She ensured her daughter could recite poetry, understand estate accounts, and hold her own in a court where words were as dangerous as swords. For a moment, it seems this story might defy its grim trajectory. But the medieval world was not kind to hope, especially for a girl like Margaret. Her inheritance, documented in the royal rolls of 1444, included estates across Bedfordshire and beyond, a fortune that turned heads in a kingdom teetering on the edge of civil war. By the time she could barely walk, the vultures were circling. Nobles whispered in the candlelit halls of Westminster, their breath visible in the chill, plotting to claim the Beaufort heiress. The chronicler Robert Fabian later noted that the child's wealth was her curse, drawing the eyes of men who saw not a girl, but a key to power. King Henry VI, a weak monarch swayed by advisors, held the reins of her fate. His court, a labyrinth of ambition and betrayal, was no place for a child's innocence. Margaret's mother could shield her from much, but not from the king's will, nor from the hunger of men who saw a toddler as a stepping stone to greatness. The stone walls of Bletsoe, once a sanctuary, now seemed to close in, the tapestries depicting heroic knights a mocking contrast to the reality awaiting her. The wind howled outside, carrying the promise of a storm that would soon engulf Margaret's life. The cold stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle, still echoing with the fading warmth of Margaret's early childhood, could not shield her from the ambitions of a kingdom unraveling. By 1446, at just 3 years old, Margaret Beaufort, heiress to a fortune that could sway the fortunes of noble houses, was no longer a child in the eyes of the court, but a pawn in a ruthless game of power. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, fought to keep her close, her hands guiding her daughter's tiny fingers to trace French letters, her voice soothing with bedtime tales of saints. But the world beyond Bletsoe's walls was closing in, and King Henry VI, a monarch more puppet than ruler, held the strings. In a decision that would haunt Margaret's life, the king handed her over like a prize to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, one of his most trusted and cunning advisors. The air in Westminster's Great Hall, thick with the scent of wax and ambition, buzzed with whispers as the deal was struck. Suffolk, a man whose charm masked a predator's heart, saw in Margaret not a toddler, but a vault of wealth. He married her to his 7-year-old son, John de la Pole, in a ceremony that likely took place between January and February 1450, though some chronicles hint at an earlier betrothal. Imagine it, a 3-year-old girl, her golden curls barely brushing her shoulders, dressed in a miniature gown of silk, standing before an altar she could scarcely comprehend. The words of the marriage vows, heavy with Latin, would have been gibberish to her, if she spoke at all. The chronicler John Wetham Steed noted the event with a curt line, masking its absurdity. The union of Beaufort and de la Pole was sealed, though the bride be but a babe. Even the church, that bastion of moral authority, played its part. The children were distant cousins, requiring a papal dispensation, which Pope Nicholas V granted in August 1450 with a flourish of ink, his seal pressed into wax as if blessing a transaction rather than a travesty. In the medieval world, such betrothals were not uncommon. Noble families across Europe, from the courts of France to the Italian city-states, often bound infants to secure alliances. The Paston letters, a treasure trove of 15th-century correspondence, reveals similar arrangements, like the betrothal of a young Elizabeth Paston to a man decades her senior, her family haggling over dowries as if trading livestock. Yet Margaret's case was stark in its audacity. She was not merely promised, she was delivered, her tiny hand placed in that of a boy who was himself a child, both pawns in Suffolk's grand design to cement his family's power. The castle at Wingfield, Suffolk's stronghold, would have been her new world, its tapestries depicting victories of old, its halls filled with the clink of goblets and the murmur of courtiers plotting their next move. For a moment, Suffolk's plan seemed flawless. Margaret's wealth, tied to her father's estates, would flow to his son, securing the de la Pole dynasty. But the medieval court was a treacherous place, and ambition often outpaced caution. By 1450, Suffolk's political star was plummeting. His role in negotiating peace with France, seen by many as a betrayal, had earned him enemies among the Yorkist faction. The chronicler Robert Fabian records the whispers of treason that swirled around him, fueled by his lavish lifestyle and perceived corruption. In May 1450, Suffolk was arrested, his dreams of grandeur crumbling like the cliffs of Dover. Exiled, he was murdered at sea, his body dumped unceremoniously, leaving his son and Margaret adrift. The marriage, barely consummated in name, was annulled, and Margaret, not yet 7, was thrust back onto the marriage market. The annulment, documented in royal records, was a rare mercy in a system that rarely reconsidered its bargains. Yet it came not from compassion, but from political expediency. Suffolk's fall had rendered the union useless. Margaret returned to her mother's care at Bletsoe, where the scent of lavender and the scratch of quills on parchment offered a fleeting respite. But the reprieve was short-lived. The court of Henry VI, now teetering on the edge of chaos as the Wars of the Roses loomed, was a place where innocence was a luxury few could afford. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded. Children like Catherine of Aragon, betrothed at 3 to Arthur Tudor, or Isabella of France, wed at 7, were traded to secure thrones. Yet Margaret's story carries a unique sting, for her next suitor would not be a child like John de la Pole, but a man whose ambition would leave scars far deeper than a broken betrothal. The vultures, sensing fresh opportunity, began to circle once more. King Henry VI, swayed by his advisors and desperate to shore up his faltering reign, turned his gaze to his half-brothers, Edmund and Jasper Tudor. Born of his mother's scandalous marriage to a Welsh servant, Owen Tudor, the brothers were ambitious, ruthless, and fiercely loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Their eyes, like Suffolk's before them, fixed on Margaret, not as a girl who still clutched dolls woven from straw, but as a key to wealth and influence. The wind whistling through Bletsoe's towers carried a new chill, and the flickering candlelight in Margaret's chamber seemed to dim. Her mother's protective arms could not hold back the tide of royal will, nor the hunger of men who saw a child as a means to an end. The stage was set for a marriage that would not merely bind Margaret to another, but would break her in ways that would echo through history. The year was 1455, and the air in Bletsoe Castle carried a heavier weight than the autumn mists that clung to Bedfordshire's fields. Margaret Beaufort, now 12, stood on the cusp of womanhood in a world that refused to let her remain a child. Her sharp mind, honed by her mother's lessons in French and Latin, and her delicate frame, still small for her age, belied the storm about to engulf her. King Henry VI, his reign fraying under the mounting tensions of the Wars of the Roses, made a decision that would shatter her life. He gave her to Edmund Tudor, his half-brother, a man of 24 whose ambition burned as fiercely as the torches lining the royal court. The marriage took place on November 1st, 1455, in a ceremony steeped in the cold formality of medieval politics. The chapel, likely adorned with flickering candles and the faint scent of incense, was no place for joy. Margaret, dressed in a gown far too heavy for her slight shoulders, stood before Edmund, a man twice her age. His eyes not on her face, but on the fortune she carried. The chronicler John Harding noted the union with a terse remark. The Beaufort heiress was wed to the king's brother, her wealth to bolster his name. To Edmund, Margaret was not a girl who still played with dolls in the quiet moments of her chamber. She was a vault of land and titles, a womb to secure his legacy. In medieval England, child marriages were common, a tool to forge alliances or consolidate power. The Paston Letters, brimming with the raw voices of the time, describe similar unions, like that of Marjorie Paston, betrothed at a tender age to secure her family's standing. But there was an unspoken rule, even in that brutal era. Consummation was delayed until the bride was at least 14, preferably older. This was not born of kindness, but of grim practicality. Medieval midwives and physicians, though lacking modern knowledge, knew the dangers of early pregnancy. Chronicles from the period, like those of the Crowland Abbey, recount tales of young brides dying in labor, their bodies too fragile for the ordeal. The 14th-century medical text Trocula, widely circulated, warned that childbirth before full physical maturity could lead to grievous harm both to mother and child. Edmund Tudor ignored this wisdom. Within days of the wedding, perhaps even on the wedding night itself, he forced himself upon Margaret. The act was not merely a violation of custom, but a calculated cruelty. Historian Elizabeth Norton, drawing from contemporary accounts, states it plainly. It was acceptable to marry a child, but to bed her so young was not. Margaret, at 12, could not legally or emotionally consent. Her body, still growing, was unprepared for what was inflicted upon her. Imagine her in that moment, a girl, barely past childhood, alone in a candlelit chamber, the weight of a man's ambition pressing down on her. The tapestries on the walls, depicting chivalric heroes, mocked her powerlessness. Her thoughts, unrecorded but all too human, must have swirled with confusion, fear, and a dawning sense of betrayal by the world that should have protected her. Edmund's reasons were as cold as the November frost. Medieval inheritance laws, as detailed in the Statutes of the Realm, were clear. If an heiress died without children, her lands reverted to her family. But if she bore a child, her husband could hold her estates for life, even if she died. Edmund, a man of Welsh blood and Lancastrian loyalty, saw in Margaret a chance to cement his place in England's volatile hierarchy. The sooner she was pregnant, the sooner his fortune was secured, even if it cost her life. By April 1456, the unthinkable was confirmed. Margaret was pregnant at 12. The realization must have been a quiet terror, her body changing in ways she could barely comprehend. Morning sickness would have gripped her, a child still learning to navigate the world, now forced to carry another life within her. The servants at Edmund's household, perhaps at Llanfy Castle in Wales, would have whispered behind their hands, their pity mingling with helplessness. The physical toll was immediate. Medieval medical texts, like those attributed to the physician Gilbertus Anglicus, describe how pregnancy in such young girls could stunt growth, weaken bones, and strain organs not yet ready for such a burden. Margaret, described in contemporary accounts as small and slight, was particularly vulnerable. Her hips had not widened, her frame still that of a child. The baby growing inside her was a ticking clock, each month bringing her closer to an ordeal her body was not equipped to survive. Beyond the physical, the emotional weight was crushing. Margaret was no stranger to loss. Her father's suicide, her first betrothal, the upheaval of her young life. But this was different. She was alone in a marriage that felt more like a transaction. Her husband a stranger driven by greed rather than affection. The court, buzzing with the intrigues of the Wars of the Roses, paid little heed to her plight. Other noble girls faced similar fates. Isabella of Castile, wed at 13, or Joan of Navarre, betrothed at 10. But Margaret's story stands out for its stark brutality, for the way Edmund's haste defied even the loose moral code of his time. As spring turned to summer, Margaret's belly swelled, a visible sign of the violation she had endured. The fields outside the castle bloomed with wildflowers, but inside, the air grew heavy with dread. She was a child, carrying a child, her future hanging by a thread as fragile as the life within her. Edmund, meanwhile, was distracted by the escalating conflict of the Wars of the Roses, his loyalty to the Lancastrian cause pulling him into the fray. His ambition had set this tragedy in motion, but he would not live to see its climax. The wheels of fate were turning, and Margaret's nightmare was far from over. The summer of 1456 hung heavy over Wales, where the winds carried the scent of salt from the coast and the distant rumble of conflict. Margaret Beaufort, barely 12 and a half, was 7 months pregnant. Her small frame strained under the weight of a child she was never meant to bear so young. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, had secured his claim to her fortune through the brutal act that left her pregnant, but his ambitions were about to unravel. The Wars of the Roses, that bloody struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York, were tearing England apart. In July 1456, Edmund, a staunch Lancastrian, was caught in a skirmish with Yorkist forces. The clash was swift and merciless, and by the time the dust settled, he was a prisoner in Carmarthen Castle, far from the Lamphy estate where Margaret waited. The chronicler, Robert Fabian, recorded the event with grim brevity. Edmund Tudor, taken by his foes, languished in chains. By November, on the first anniversary of their marriage, Edmund was dead. The official cause listed as plague, though whispers of poison or neglect lingered in the courtly gossip recorded in the Paston letters. Margaret, now 13, widowed and heavily pregnant, stood alone in a world that had already taken so much from her. The castle at Lamphy, with its stone walls and flickering hearths, offered little comfort. The servants, their faces etched with pity, could do nothing to ease the terror of a girl facing childbirth in a body barely past puberty. Margaret could have stayed, surrounded by the remnants of Edmund's household, but she made a choice that revealed the steel forming in her young heart. Despite her pregnancy, despite the winter's bite, despite the dangers of a kingdom fracturing under civil war, she resolved to travel to Pembroke Castle, seeking the protection of her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. The journey was a gamble with death. The roads of 15th-century Wales were little more than muddy tracks, rutted by cartwheels and treacherous with bandits or stray soldiers. The Crowland Chronicle mentions the perils of travel during the Wars of the Roses, with roads unsafe and loyalties uncertain. Margaret, her belly swollen, rode in a jolting litter, or perhaps on horseback, each step sending jolts of pain through her fragile frame. The wind howled, carrying the threat of snow, and the skeletal trees along the path seemed to mirror her own vulnerability. Yet she pressed on, driven by a survival instinct that belied her years. Pembroke Castle, a fortress of gray stone perched on a rocky outcrop, was Jasper's stronghold, a Lancastrian bastion in a land of shifting allegiances. Jasper, like his brother Edmund, was ambitious, but his loyalty to Margaret was rooted in family and politics rather than greed. The castle's great hall, warmed by roaring fires, would have been a stark contrast to the perilous journey. But for Margaret, it was merely a new stage for her ordeal. She arrived in late 1456, her body aching, her mind a tangle of fear and resolve. The servants, accustomed to the comings and goings of war, must have marveled at the sight of this tiny, pregnant girl, her face pale, but her eyes burning with determination. The cultural context of the time, as seen in contemporary accounts, like those of the Paston family, reveals the precarious role of women in wartime. Noble ladies often managed estates or fled to safety, but Margaret's situation was unique, a child widow carrying a child, her fate tied to the survival of both. Her resilience was not just physical, but emotional, a testament to the inner strength that would define her later years. The chronicles of the time, sparse on women's inner lives, hint at her courage. A letter from Jasper to a fellow Lancastrian notes the Lady Margaret's safe arrival, though her state be delicate. Delicate was an understatement. On January 28, 1457, as the winter winds battered Pembroke's walls, Margaret's labor began. The chamber was a world of shadows and firelight, the air thick with the scent of herbs burned to ward off evil spirits. Midwives, their hands rough from years of delivering babies, moved with practiced urgency, but their faces betrayed their fear. Margaret was tiny, her hips narrow, her body unprepared for the task before it. The baby, positioned awkwardly, refused to move. Hour after hour, her screams echoed through the stone corridors, a sound that would have chilled even the hardened soldiers guarding the castle. The midwives exchanged glances, their knowledge drawn from generations of births, but useless against the reality of a child's body in labor. Medieval midwifery, as described in texts like The Sickness of Women, relied on herbal remedies and prayers, but no poultice could widen a pelvis or ease the trauma unfolding. The labor was not just painful, it was catastrophic. Margaret's small stature, noted in contemporary accounts as slight and frail, made the birth a battle for survival. The baby was coming, but her body offered no path. The midwives, their aprons stained, worked in a frenzy, their muttered prayers mingling with Margaret's cries. The room, lit by flickering candles, seemed to close in, the tapestries of heroic battles, a cruel mockery of the fight happening on the bed. Outside, the wind howled, as if nature itself mourned what was being done to this girl. The ordeal stretched on, each moment a test of endurance for a body and soul pushed beyond their limits. Margaret's journey to Pembroke, her widowhood, her pregnancy, all converged in this moment, a crucible that would forge her into something harder, sharper, but at a cost no child should ever pay. The chamber in Pembroke Castle was a battlefield, its stone walls closing in as Margaret Beaufort, just 13, fought for her life and that of the child within her. January 28, 1457, was a day etched in agony, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning herbs and the stifling heat of a fire that did little to warm the terror in the room. Margaret's screams, raw and unrelenting, pierced the winter night. Her small body, racked by a labor it was never meant to endure. The midwives, their faces drawn with fear, worked with trembling hands, their experience no match for the crisis unfolding. Margaret was tiny, her frame described in contemporary accounts as small and slight, her pelvis not yet widened by the years that should have come before motherhood. The baby was stuck, lodged in a birth canal too narrow to yield, and each contraction, was a brutal assault on a body still caught between childhood and womanhood. The Crowland Chronicle, sparse but haunting, notes the event. The Lady Margaret, scarce more than a child, brought forth a son at great peril to her life. The specifics of that room are lost to history, but the horror can be pieced together from what followed and from the grim realities of medieval childbirth. The labor was protracted, lasting hours, perhaps days, each moment stretching Margaret's endurance to its breaking point. Medieval texts like Trotula warn of the dangers of childbirth in young girls, describing how the womb of a maid, yet unformed, may tear asunder under such strain. Margaret's body was no exception. The pressure of the baby's head against her immature pelvis likely caused catastrophic damage, tissue tearing, possible fistulas, and internal scarring that would mark her for life. Modern medical understanding, while absent in 1457, sheds light on the trauma. Girls under 15 face risks of obstructed labor, leading to injuries like vesico-vaginal fistulas, which could cause lifelong pain and incontinence. Margaret's survival was nothing short of miraculous, as her confessor, John Fisher, would later attest in a sermon after her death in 1509. He called it a miracle that a babe could be born of so little a personage. His words heavy with awe and horror at the memory of that day. The baby, a boy named Henry, survived, destined to become Henry VII, founder of the Tudor Dynasty. But survival came at a cost that Margaret would carry forever. The birth was so traumatic that it rendered her infertile, a fact starkly evident in her later life. In an era where noblewomen often bore 10 or more children, Elizabeth of York, Margaret's daughter-in-law, had 7. Margaret never conceived again, despite remarrying twice. The Paston Letters, which capture the relentless expectation of heirs, underscore how unusual this was, with one correspondent noting a noblewoman's failure to bear as a mark of divine disfavor. For Margaret, it was no curse but a scar, a permanent reminder of the violence done to her body at 13. The physical toll was matched by a psychological weight that would shape her forever. Orphaned by her father's suicide, married off as a toddler, widowed while pregnant, and now nearly killed by childbirth, Margaret's world was one of relentless loss. Her relationship with her son, Henry, became the anchor of her existence, a bond that some historians, like Michael K. Jones, suggest bordered on obsession. This intensity may have been a trauma response, a desperate need to protect the life she had nearly died to bring into the world. Imagine her in the days after the birth, lying in a darkened chamber, her body broken, her mind reeling. The midwives, their hands still stained with the blood of her ordeal, would have tended her with herbal poultices and prayers, but no remedy could heal the deeper wounds. The castle's stone walls, cold and unyielding, mirrored the isolation of a girl who had faced death and emerged changed. The emotional scars were as profound as the physical ones. Modern studies on childhood trauma, while not available to Margaret's contemporaries, suggest that such experiences could lead to hypervigilance and a fierce drive to control one's environment, traits Margaret would display in her later years as a political mastermind. Yet in that moment, she was still a child, clutching her newborn son, his tiny cries a fragile tether to a future she could scarcely imagine. The birth's aftermath was a quiet devastation. The midwives, exhausted, likely whispered among themselves of the miracle they had witnessed, but also of the tragedy. The room, once a crucible of pain, now held a mother and child bound by a shared survival, but at a cost that would echo through Margaret's life. Her body, described by Fisher as so little, had been pushed beyond its limits, and the damage was irreparable. The chronicler William Gregory later wrote of her as a lady marked by great trial, an understated nod to the ordeal that defined her youth. Outside, the Wars of the Roses raged on, the world uncaring of the drama in Pembroke's chamber. Jasper Tudor, her protector, ensured her safety, but even he could not shield her from the consequences of what had been done. Margaret's story at this juncture is not just one of survival, but of a child forced to grow up in the crucible of pain, whose resilience forged in the fires of an ordeal that should never have been hers to bear. The baby in her arms, Henry, was a symbol of hope, but also a reminder of the price she had paid, a price that would shape her into the formidable woman she would become, but at a cost no child should ever endure. The embers of the fire in Pembroke Castle had long since faded, but the scars of January 28, 1457, burned eternal in Margaret Beaufort's soul. At 13, she had survived the unsurvivable, emerging from the crucible of childbirth as a mother to Henry, the future Henry VII, but at a cost that shadowed her every step. As she grew, so did her resolve, transforming her from a broken child into a political titan whose influence would reshape England. Yet her story, preserved in chronicles like those of John Fisher and the Crowland Abbey, is not merely one of triumph, but a haunting reflection of a system that commodified women's bodies, and a testament to the resilience of a girl who refused to be defined by her suffering. Margaret's later life was a masterclass in navigating the treacherous waters of Tudor politics. Widowed at 13, she married again at 14, this time to Henry Stafford, a union that brought stability but no children, her body still bearing the wounds of her first labor. After Stafford's death in 1471, she wed Thomas Stanley, a powerful noble whose alliance bolstered her influence. The Paston Letters, a window into the era's intrigues, mention her as a lady of great cunning, orchestrating alliances with the precision of a chess master. She became a patron of education, founding Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge, her name etched in stone as a benefactress who valued knowledge as a shield against powerlessness. Yet her heart remained tethered to her son, Henry, whom she raised with fierce devotion, guiding him through exile and rebellion, until he claimed the throne in 1485 after the Battle of Bosworth. Her signature, Margaret R., bold and regal, hinted at a woman who saw herself as near royal, a queen in all but name. But the ghosts of her past never left her. Decades later, when her granddaughter, Margaret Tudor, was betrothed at 13 to James IV of Scotland, Margaret fought to protect her. Alongside Elizabeth of York, her daughter-in-law, she pleaded with her son, Henry VII, to delay the marriage. Her words recorded in royal correspondence: "The Queen and my mother fear the King of Scots will not wait, but injure her and endanger her health." The plea was raw, born of a visceral memory of her own violation at 12 by Edmund Tudor. She knew the cost of a man's impatience, the way it could shatter a girl's body and spirit. Her fight was not just for her granddaughter, but for every girl caught in the same brutal cycle. Yet the political machine, as relentless in 1503 as it had been in 1455, ground on. Margaret Tudor was sent to Scotland, married at 13, and bore children while still a teenager, her health strained as her grandmother had feared. The failure to protect her granddaughter was a wound that cut deep, a reminder that even Margaret's formidable power could not dismantle the system that had broken her. This cycle of child marriage was not unique to England. Across Europe, girls like Catherine of Aragon, wed at 15, or Anne of Brittany, betrothed at 11, were pawns in dynastic games. The Annals of France recount similar tales, noting how young maids were oft given to men before their time, to the ruin of their bodies. Margaret's story, though, stands as a stark indictment of a society that normalized such practices while knowing their horror. Medieval contracts, as seen in legal records like the Statutes of the Realm, often stipulated delays in consummation, yet men like Edmund Tudor flouted these norms for profit. Their actions, tacitly condoned by a complicit court. The psychological toll on Margaret, though unarticulated in her time, can be understood through modern lenses. Survivors of childhood trauma often channel their pain into fierce determination, a trait Margaret displayed in her relentless support for Henry's claim to the throne. Obsession with his safety, noted by historian Michael K. Jones, may have stemmed from the near-death experience of his birth, a moment that bound them in shared survival. Her later piety, documented by Fisher, was equally intense. She prayed daily, funded chapels, and sought solace in faith, perhaps to reconcile the violence done to her with the belief it was God's will. Yet her faith could not erase the truth. What happened to her was wrong, even by the standards of her era. The broader implications of Margaret's story ripple through history. The Tudor Dynasty, celebrated for Henry VIII's dramatic reign and Elizabeth I's golden age, was built on the broken body of a 13-year-old girl. Every Tudor rose, that symbol of unity, was stained with her blood. The chronicler William Gregory called her a lady of great sorrow, a nod to the price she paid for a dynasty she never chose to create. Her story resonates today. In a world where child marriage persists, UNICEF data from 2025 estimates 12 million girls are married before 18 annually, their bodies and futures traded for power or profit. Margaret stands as a reminder of the human cost of such systems, her survival a testament to resilience, but her trauma a warning of what happens when society fails its children. When she died on June 29, 1509, 5 days after her 66th birthday, Margaret had outlived 4 husbands, seen her son crowned, and her grandson, Henry VIII, ascend the throne. She had amassed wealth, shaped history, and left a legacy in stone and blood. But she never bore another child. The trauma of 1457 had closed that door forever, a silent scar beneath her triumphs. Her final act, as recorded by Fisher, was to ensure her son's legacy, but her true legacy lies in her story's unvarnished truth. She was not just the mother of the Tudors, but a girl who endured the unendurable, a child whose suffering seeded a dynasty. The midwives at Pembroke called her survival a miracle, but it was a preventable one, a miracle born of failure, of a king, a court, a society that saw a 12-year-old as property, not a person. Margaret's life demands we remember her not as a footnote in Tudor glory, but as a child who deserved better, whose pain built an empire, and whose voice, through her fight for her granddaughter, still echoes. She was 12 years old when Edmund Tudor destroyed her body for his ambition. She was 13 when she nearly died giving birth. She was 66 when she died, a titan of history, but forever marked by the child she had been. Her story is a call to protect the vulnerable, to break the cycles of power that crush the innocent, to honor the truth behind the Tudor rose, a truth watered with the tears of a girl who should have been spared. What do you think about this story? Leave a comment below so we can discuss it together. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories.